At the end of World War II in 1945, the Soviet Union and the Western democracies, including the United States, were allies who worked side by side in defeating the Axis powers of Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire. By the mid-1980s, just 40 years later, they had around 60,000 nuclear weapons pointed at each other, enough to destroy the entire world multiple times. I'm Pastor Pat. Thanks for joining us for this year's Memorial Day edition of Base Camp. Despite fighting on the same side in World War II, the relationship between the United States and our allies and the Soviet Union and its satellite states quickly deteriorated after the war. And with the Soviet Union becoming a nuclear power on August 29, 1949, the rivalry between the two sides took on a deadly dimension for the whole world. So, what happened? How did these friends become the bitterest of enemies? At the end of World War II, with Nazi Germany destroyed and defeated and Japan surrendering, the nations that had worked together for victory had to figure out how to put the world back together again. Unfortunately, they had two very different ideas about what the post-war world should look like. The countries in the West were primarily democracies, nations that believed in individual liberty and that the people had the God-given right to determine for themselves how they wanted both their government and their own lives to be run. The Soviet Union was communist. Communist nations did not believe in the value of the individual, but saw the nation as a collective of people that needed to be controlled and directed by the government. For the most part, communist nations were atheistic, meaning a belief that there is no God, and therefore the government is the highest authority and the one who gets to determine what rights people may or may not have. As the war ended, the countries fighting against the Axis powers, the name for the group of countries led by Germany and Japan, took over the areas that had been controlled by them and began to reestablish the nations that had been torn apart by the Axis. In the West, the United States, Great Britain, and the rest of the Allies set these nations up as democracies, allowing the people who lived there to decide what their governments would look like and giving them great freedom. They even did this in the western side of Germany that they had taken over. In the East, where the Soviet Union had driven out the Axis powers, they held on to their newly acquired regions with a firm hand. Instead of liberating these nations and giving the people back their freedom, the Soviets set up the governments for them, putting people in charge who would do whatever the Soviet Union told them to do. These controlled nations were called satellites, because just as a satellite in space orbits and is controlled by the Earth, these countries were held in the Soviet Union's orbit and controlled by them. They did this all the way into the eastern part of Germany that they occupied. As it became clear to the Western democracies that the Soviet Union had no intention of giving the people of Eastern Europe back their freedom, they became concerned. On March 5, 1946, less than a year after the end of World War II, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, made a speech declaring that across Europe,
an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
The Soviet Union was striving to take over as much of the world as possible and spread communism with it. The Western democracies were bound and determined to stop them and defend freedom. The Cold War had begun. The Cold War is the name given for the time period when the Soviets and the West were competing with one another. Both sides built up larger and larger armies and more destructive weapons. It was like a war in that there was severe distrust and even hatred, and huge sums of money was spent on the military, with both sides always prepared for armed conflict with the other. But for the most part, there wasn't much actual fighting between them. That's why it's called a Cold War. They acted like they were at war with each other, but because of how strong both sides were and how much damage both sides could do to one another, neither side actually wanted to fight. the Western nations formed an alliance, an agreement that they would help one another if they were ever attacked. They called this alliance the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO for short. It was primarily led by the United States. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union formed their own alliance with countries that they controlled. They called it the Warsaw Pact, named for the capital city of Poland, one of the Soviet Union's satellite states. The Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact had great military might. Thankfully, for the most part, the military forces of NATO were able to keep them in check. Here in the West, we owe a debt of gratitude to the men and women who served in our armed forces. They protected the citizens of their countries through great personal sacrifice. And though for the most part it was a Cold War, there were times when the Cold War heated up, and there was actual fighting. Times like the Korean and Vietnam Wars and countless other smaller battles. Servicemen and women gave their lives to defend our freedom. In the East, though, where communism and the Soviet Union reigned supreme, the military existed to hold the people down and to keep them from experiencing freedom. Walls and fortifications were put up to not only keep the Western countries out, but to keep their own people in. Berlin, the former capital of Nazi Germany, had been occupied by both the Western powers and the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Now that the war was over, it was a city split in two. The Soviets controlled East Berlin, and the Western Allies controlled West Berlin. Berlin itself was in East Germany, the part of the country dominated by the Soviet Union. That meant that the West Berlin and all 2 million people who lived in it were surrounded. The Soviets wanted to take it over, and in 1948, they cut them off from all outside help. But the armed forces of the West, particularly the United States and Great Britain, used both military and civilian, non-military, planes to fly food, medicine, fuel, and other essential goods into the people of the city. It became known as the Berlin Airlift. They did this for over a year until finally the Soviet Union backed down and allowed goods to enter the city again. The military, though not having used force, saved the people of West Berlin and their freedom. Freedom is a very strong force, and it was what the communists were trying to destroy. But people have an innate desire for it. Now that Berlin was permanently divided, the people of East Berlin, under the weight of communism, had easy access to the freedom of West Berlin. More and more began to escape across the border to the freedom that beckoned, until soon there was a mass exodus, as over 3.5 million people escaped from the east to the west. The communists could not allow this. On August 13, 1961, they built the Berlin Wall. It was designed to keep their own people imprisoned and became a potent symbol of the differences between East and West. On one side, slavery and fear. On the other, freedom and opportunity. But every wall eventually crumbles. NATO kept up the pressure on the Soviet Union for approximately 45 years. With the military applying pressure to the Soviets while also holding them at bay, the communists were unable to achieve the victory that they desired. At the same time, the natural desire of the people under their control began to chip away at their power. The people began to gather in large crowds and demand their freedom. Then, on November 9th, 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall fell.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands.
The East German government had announced that they would open the gates, and the people swarmed through the gates and over the wall in droves. Germany was soon reunited. And within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself no longer existed. People around the world owe a debt of freedom to the people who served in the military in the nations of the West, particularly the United States. Those men and women kept their own country safe from communism while also giving support to the people trapped under its tyranny so that they might ultimately defeat it and escape. We want to honor them this Memorial Day. But as amazing as the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War was, as great as the freedom is that has been gained in many of those countries, it's fragile and even breaking in some places. Today, new authoritarians have taken over some of those places and begun to remove the freedoms that were so difficult to attain. Why? Because people are not just imprisoned by governments and armies and walls, but by our very nature. Though we desire freedom, we cannot attain it. Jesus says in John chapter 8, verse 34 that everyone who sins is a slave to sin. And everyone sins. Anything that we think, say, or do that goes against God is sin. And though we know that it isn't good for us, it controls us. We can't break free. But God does not want us to die in slavery. He wants us to live in freedom. That's why He sent Jesus. In Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19, Jesus reads the words of the prophet Isaiah, written over 700 years before He was born, and applies them to Himself. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus is saying it's time for the sin wall to come down. It's time to step into the true freedom that He offers us, a freedom that is everlasting. Jesus fought the fight against sin for us. He gave His life on the cross to defeat it, and He rose again from the dead, proving His victory. All we have to do is walk across the crumbled remains of that wall and receive it. We owe our military great gratitude for keeping us free and helping make possible the freedom of millions of people around the world. To those who have served and their families, thank you. Now, let's receive the ultimate freedom that Jesus offers us. Simply tell Him yes. You believe that He died and rose again for you, and that you want to accept His forgiveness and free gift of eternal life and freedom. That's it. Then, to grow in that relationship with Him, get involved in a church, read your Bible, and pray and talk to God. Live in the freedom He's provided. Watching the celebration of those who'd been set free from communism is something that I'll remember for the rest of my life. Even greater is a celebration that we can all take part in due to Jesus giving us eternal freedom. I'm Pastor Pat, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for Base Camp, a ministry of Summit Church in beautiful Bozeman, Montana. We have services every Sunday at 10 o'clock and would like to invite you to join us for them. You can also find us online at summitchurchmt.com and on Facebook and YouTube at Summit Church MT. Our children's ministry Facebook page is Base Camp Kids Min. We thank those who have served the cause of freedom in the military and their families this Memorial Day weekend and wish all of you a blessed Memorial Day. I hope to see you again real soon.